Thank you all for coming. My talk expands on its epigraph, Principles of Ontology, the briefer course. There is stuff. Some stuff is aware of other stuff. Some stuff is not aware of other stuff. Epistemological addendum. Nobody knows why this is so. To which I should add that there's not only stuff, there's also nonsense. And often in the hour to come, you may be led to wonder if I can tell the difference. Wittgenstein once suggested that there could be a work of philosophy consisting of nothing but jokes. And if we combine this with Socrates' teaching that philosophy is the preparation for death, we might come to the happiest of conclusions and exit laughing, no matter how serious things seem to get. My one sorrow on this otherwise jubilant occasion is that it might have been funnier. As it came to me during the days and nights of its preparation, beginning on or about April Fool's Day as it happened, my talk, with a certain self-worshipping delight, kept interrupting itself with jokes, puns, parodies, and all sorts of whimsical ditties, but the demands of brevity and good sense required me to delete them. I like to think of that as original utterance as the rich text format. This is the Word version, all the news I thought fit to print. It is possible, of course, that the biggest joke of all still remains, but had I moved with the remover to remove it, I would have expunged myself and wound up on the cutting room floor. As you see, that didn't happen, and here I am to compound, deliver, and personate the joke, prepared to natter on about consciousness itself, something, if it is something, which I cannot explain, and about which there may be nothing that can be said, and thereof, were I to follow the advice of one of my virtual mentors, I should be silent, and soon enough I shall, but not right now. It must seem then that all is lost, but that is not really such a bad place to find ourselves. So here we are, almost outside the city, sitting under an imaginary plane tree, near a place once sacred to the gods, and you beside me in the wilderness, waiting, I hope, to be seduced. As for that happening, you may think I do not have a prayer, but I do. Grant me, great Pan, the power of regenerative speech, but save me from an influx of the howling might of Boreas, lest by my airy stirrings we should all be blown away. Hold me steadfast in my animal being. Help me to keep my grandiosities buttoned, and the trousers of my fancy rolled, and let not the fruit of my labors be an apple of discord, an Augustinian pear, a Prufrockian peach, or another wind egg. Does consciousness exist? Asked the bold and candid thinker William James in an essay he entitled with this question. Here is his answer. I believe, he said, that consciousness is the name of a non-entity. Those who still cling to it are clinging to a mere echo, the first rumor left behind by the disappearing soul upon the air of philosophy. For 20 years past, I have mistrusted consciousness as an entity. For 7 or 8 years past, I have suggested its non-existence to my students. It seems to me that the hour is ripe for it to be openly and universally discarded. This is an arresting assertion, especially coming from the intrepid explorer of the stream of consciousness that flows so significantly through the pages of the Principles of Psychology. And it is doubly surprising because its scrutiny was said by him to be central to his method of investigation. Introspective observation is what we have to rely on first and foremost and always, he said there. This means looking into our own minds and reporting what we find. Everyone agrees that we there discover states of consciousness. To deny that we have a direct awareness of our thinking as such would violate common sense and contradict the fundamental assumption of every philosophic school. Spiritualists, transcendentalists, and empiricists alike admit in us a direct perception of the thinking activity in the concrete. But as he is quick to make clear, he has not abandoned his earlier convictions unequivocally in raising now the question of whether consciousness exists. To deny its existence, he admits, seems utterly absurd on the face of it. Therefore, he says, let me immediately explain that I mean only to deny that the word stands for an entity, but to insist most emphatically that it does stand for a function. There is no aboriginal stuff or immaterial quality of being out of which our thoughts are made. But thoughts do exist, and there is a function in experience which thoughts perform. It is for the performance of this function that consciousness is usually invoked. That function is knowing. James' central claim is that if we start with the supposition that there is only one primal stuff or material in the world out of which everything is composed, and if we call that stuff pure experience, then knowing can be accounted for as a particular sort of relation into which portions of pure experience may enter. He hopes by this maneuver to eradicate the dualism of thought and things, spirit and matter, and especially the conviction that we are subjects to whom objects appear as representations, since that is what leads to the notion of an outer world where things really are and an inner world in which they appear to us. He rejects this and posits instead a doubling activity which takes the same experience twice over, calling one inner and one outer. In the end, though, James himself doubts that he has made his argument convincing. But, he concludes, a last cry of non-possumus will probably go up from many readers. All very pretty as a piece of ingenuity, they will say, but our consciousness itself intuitively contradicts you. We, for our part, know that we are conscious. We feel our thought flowing as a life within us, in absolute contrast with the objects which it so unremittingly escorts. We cannot be faithless to this immediate intuition. The dualism is a fundamental datum. Let no man join what God has put asunder. My reply to this, he says, is my last word, and I greatly grieve that to many it will seem materialistic. I cannot help that, however, for I too have my intuitions, and I must obey them. Let the case be what it may be in others, I am as confident as I am of anything that, in myself, the stream of thinking, which I recognize emphatically as a phenomenon, is only a careless name for what, when scrutinized, reveals itself to consist chiefly of the stream of my breathing. The I think, which Kant said must be able to accompany all my objects, is the I breathe, which actually does accompany them. Breath, which was ever the original of spirit, breath moving outwards between the glottis and the nostrils, is, I am persuaded, the essence out of which philosophers have constructed the entity known to them as consciousness. That entity is fictitious, while thoughts in the concrete are fully real. But thoughts in the concrete are made of the same stuff as things are. I wish, he concludes, I might believe myself to have made that plausible in this article. James's last word, which he fears might sound too materialistic, echoes a passage from the chapter on the consciousness of self in the Principles of Psychology, where the self is said to be something with which we have direct sensible acquaintance, and he undertakes there to describe what we feel as the central nucleus of our palpitating inward life. When we come to the closest possible quarters with the facts, he says, it is difficult for me to detect in the activity any purely spiritual element at all. Whenever my introspective glance succeeds in turning round quickly enough to catch one of these manifestations of spontaneity in the act, all it can ever feel distinctly is some bodily process, for the most part taking place within the head. A few paragraphs later, after recounting his experience of these bodily sensations in some detail, he restates this conclusion even more emphatically. In a sense, then, it may be truly said that in one person at least, the self of selves, when carefully examined, is found to consist mainly of the collection of these peculiar motions in the head or between the head and the throat. Perhaps there is more to it than that, he adds, but if not, it would follow that our entire feeling of spiritual activity, or what commonly passes by that name, is really a feeling of bodily activities whose exact nature is by most men overlooked. Although James bumps into the body in this way fairly often in his scrutinizing, he never forthrightly declares the body to be the thinker. Perhaps he did not want to see our psychic life given into the keeping of a deterministic science and reduced to mechanical causes. Perhaps, too, without quite being ready to affirm it, he did not want to deny it the possibility of a spiritual dimension. There might be, as he said, in the varieties of religious experience, a higher part of ourselves that is conterminous and continuous with a more of the same quality which is operative in the universe outside us and which we can keep in working touch with. This reminds us of another direction thought has been known to take when it is most intent on looking after itself. And James' invocation of it recalls Emerson's view of this higher realm. There is, Emerson says, that unity, that oversoul, in which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other, Within man is the soul of the whole, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. And this deep power in which we exist is self-sufficing and perfect in every hour. James, not quite ready to commit to the body or quite ready to embrace the oversoul as the ground of consciousness, nods in the direction of each and hovers somewhere in between. This is about where most of us probably are most of the time. We are more or less inclined to accept the modern scientific view that thinking goes on in the body, and particularly in the brain, but we are also influenced by the time-honored view that consciousness is something other and something more that is not ultimately attached to the body and might be capable of existing without it and going off on its own. Although there is something to be said for attempting to follow consciousness into this supervenient realm, caution is advisable. What thinking sees when it looks at itself is a lot less certain than the fact of its looking. All we are able to say so far is that there seems to be something to look at, and there seems to be something that looks. But that still says too much. To speak perspicuously, there is a looking and a looked at. That's all we have. Perhaps, properly considered, it may prove to be enough. Watching and watched, each implicit in the other, and then explicitly apart. Often when talking about consciousness, we must wonder if we are speaking of one being or two. "My, but how becoming you are," said being one to being two. "But how are you my becoming," said being two to being one. Or was it the other way around? Surely, you must think, this is the sort of nonsense that threatened from the start. Yes, but out of some such speaking, as we have anciently heard, there may come a lot of stuff. Witness the Upanishads, where the story is put about like this. In the beginning there was the self, one alone, and there was no other being. It thought to itself, "Let me create the worlds." It sent forth all that is. Having sent it forth, it entered into it. Having entered into it, it became what is manifest and unmanifest. It was in the highest and moved by the highest and has become the Lord of all things. The great self is always and everywhere, like the ether, and from that ether it wakes the world, which consists of thoughts only, and by it alone is all this meditated on, and in this it is dissolved. All things take their rise from it and return to it. It is their nest. Heaven and earth are contained within it, fire and air, sun and moon, lightning and stars. Whatever there is in the world, or has been, or will be, is contained within it. Now we have soared to the ultimate reaches of thought, where consciousness, as the great self, or the one, exuberant in its self-celebration, calls forth that which is other than itself, encompasses all that thereupon arises, and anoints itself Lord and Maker of everything that is. Here in the nursery of the all abide as well the unruly offspring of thought that forever play about its perimeter, the nascent oppositions of being and not being, the one and the many, time and eternity, appearance and reality, subject and object, body and soul. But it is not to entertain their prospect that this foray is undertaken. It is to emphasize the primal power of consciousness, its ability to alter itself and become other than it is. It is, to this extent, its own ground. But contrary to its self-affirming presupposition, it does not sustain itself, and it is not the stuff of which all things are made. As the claims it makes for itself give witness, thinking has a habit of taking itself very seriously. When it looks into itself and finds nothing there but itself alone, it takes this to be direct evidence of its self-subsistent being. Thinking about thinking is a very quiet activity. For it to occur, the clamor of the world and the body's excitements must subside. This makes it easy for it to mistake where it comes from. Looking at itself, it seems to float free. Finding itself always already there, its physical workings invisible to it, and unable to examine its grounds directly, it thinks it has none. This is its natural blind spot. It deems itself to be substantial, and the notion of itself as a disembodied thinker seems appealing and plausible. An extreme expression of this is Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," which leads him without embarrassment to state what follows from it. I am a substance whose whole essence or nature consists entirely of thinking, and which for its existence has need of no place and is not dependent on any material thing, so that this I, that is to say the soul by which I am what I am, is entirely distinct from the body, and would not itself cease to be all that it is, even should the body cease to exist. And speaking of stuff and nonsense, this must be among the all-time great contenders. The blithe dismissal of the body propounded by Descartes has, at least for me, a singular and undeniable merit. It makes me fully aware of my deepest conviction, my one unshakable certainty. I am the body's man. I am not a being with a body. I am a body, and a body only. I have never supposed I was, or ever could be, anything else. An animal capable of thinking I more or less happily claim to be, and undoubtedly am, but nothing more. As for any kind of mental entity or substance that I might call my own, I am ready to chime in with James and call it a mere echo, the first rumor left behind by the disappearing soul upon the air of philosophy, and his attribution of its source to breath, which was ever the original of spirit moving outward between the glottis and the nostrils, as he put it, is apt enough, since psyche means both breath and soul in Greek. Their likeness has been noted elsewhere too, as in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where it is said, "Now the formless soul is the wind and the atmosphere. This is immortal. Now the formless soul is the space and the breath which is within the self. This is immortal. He who breathes in with your breathing in is the soul of yours which is in all things. He who breathes out with your breathing out is the soul of yours which is in all things." Ontologically speaking, of course, these affirmations are worlds apart, despite their seeming similarity. For the writer of the Brihadaranyaka, spirit and breath are the same substance, and ultimately the substance of everything. For James, they are the same substance, but breath merely. To say that spirit or soul is only breath sounds like an airy dismissal of it, and perhaps it is, yet there is something suggestive in it. Call breathing by another of its names, and soul or spirit is aspiration. All cleverness aside, this is very much what it is and how it is. I am a thing which aspires without limit to ever greater and better things, says Descartes in the third of his Meditations. Perhaps this aspiration, thought moving outward and upward and going beyond itself forever, bespeaks as well as anything the natural origins of the immaterial soul. Born of the ability of consciousness to regard itself in action, the soul is a self-substantiating nexus that brings itself to our attention as a second but incorporeal body, more real and more enduring than anything of flesh and bone. As such, it takes itself to be the true subject of experience, capable of feeling pleasures and pains, having passions and emotions, making and entertaining thoughts. Multifarious in its being and doing, it dwells in the utmost privacy within, yet it speeds afar unbounded. It comprehends whatever is and makes it manifest, and at its most rarefied and evanescent is present in its absence as a pure transparency, a local representative of the ultimate ever-watcher, the unseen seer, the unheard hearer, the unthought thinker, named in the Upanishads. Although the soul is not the self-subsistent entity it takes itself to be, its presumption makes apparent the body's urge to transcend itself, and as the emblem of a self-seeing intelligence, it reflects the power that consciousness has to change itself and other things. Thus it reminds us that we are not merely the sum of our physiological determinants, and the source of our actions cannot be reduced to our animal origins and derived from them simply. It is the fact of our being aware of our being, the fact from which the conception of the soul arises, that makes this so. A human being, Wittgenstein notes in his philosophical investigations, can encourage himself, give himself orders, obey, blame, and punish himself. He can ask himself a question and answer it. This states succinctly much of what I have been saying at greater length and am about to say again. We can watch what we are doing and respond to it. We often do this by speaking to ourselves about it, and the conscious activities of encouraging, ordering, obeying, or blaming make a difference to the way things go. We are not forever in the thrall of circumstance. At every turn there is the question, latent or expressed, how is it with us? And after it, more questions still. How might it be? How should it be? And who says so? This perpetual colloquy of the body in converse with itself and its activities is the feature of our animal life that implicates us in a world, endows us with the self, and makes us human. Where, we might wonder, does all this happen? In consciousness? But consciousness is not a container, and in is a pronominal metaphor. We imagine that consciousness is in the body or in the brain, but this "in" is also metaphorical, and no amount of looking will find it there. How long is an imaginary foot rule? Would it fit between your ears? We can't really say that consciousness has a location. It seems to be both everywhere and nowhere. One of its own doings may provide the best analogy for this amazing circumstance. We have all learned to read, although we cannot say how we do it. The book is an instrument we have learned to play. Where is the story it tells us when we read it? Where is the language in which the story is told? And while we are reading it, where in the world is the world of the story we are in? Consciousness, wherever it may be, or by whatever name be known, spirit, soul, or mind, is activity. Sensing, feeling, believing, imagining, thinking, understanding, contemplating, doubting, judging, affirming, denying, numbering, the whole caboodle, with all their interminglings and shadings and appurtenances, these are doings it engenders, and out of which it is engendered, and bespeaks itself as the diagnostic intelligence of a body, alive to its surroundings and its ways of being in them. We see or hear something, then notice that we are doing it, as if reporting it to ourselves. A surveilling and a surveillance of it, 2 moments out of 1, and then, absorbed in the happening itself, 1 out of 2 again. There is a name that is proper to this, a name that is not merely a figure of speech or a metaphor, but one that betokens the double character of the activity itself. It is mythopoiesis, the compound word for it in Greek. I understand poiesis here not in the sense of rendering something in verse, although verse, in a manner of speaking, is its native tongue, but in the root sense of making, creating, producing, and more generally of doing. And mythos, although it can mean simply a tale, and often is such, I am taking in a more general sense to refer to speaking, or speaking out of, or that which is delivered by speech. It is tempting to suppose that one of these is more primary than the other, poiesis perhaps, with mythos as one of its doings or outcomes. But since each is implicit in the other, this defies clear stipulation. Thus, as we have been told, out of a primordial consciousness, the ancient Vedas spoke themselves, and their utterance, remembered faithfully and repeated for hundreds of generations, made itself the ur-text of your consciousness and mine. Mythopoiesis as an activity is a lived reality and not a myth, but it is the mother of all myths. In its indigenous being, consciousness may be one and whole, but it cannot remain so for long and can never be known to us as such. As humans, our burgeoning awareness is bespoken from the first. Each of us is born into a tale already being told. Hearing it, each of us begins our own account, and in its working out, we may be one with the ambient context in which our story unfolds, or at odds with it. Characteristically, we are both at once, but that is only the beginning of it. Seldom, if ever, and never any more, is there only one story to reach our ears. The air is full of voices, siren songs of every sort, to beguile, enchant, persuade, command, compel our belief or unbelief. Anecdotes, histories, tales, fables, fantasies, legends, dreams, theories, doctrines, creeds. The point is not to complete the list or to parse their differences, but only to suggest that given some scope and some number of adhering parties, any of these might be the stuff of myth, the stuff of which consciousness is made, if it is made of anything. It is not from looking directly into consciousness and trying to see it bare that we can know it for what it is. For this we must canvass the company it keeps, the tales it tells, and I believe there are no writings better suited to this purpose than Plato's, where mythopoiesis abounds. Plato's exploration of consciousness, like that in the Brihadaranyaka, extends to the farthest reaches, and encounters the oppositions that arise there, one and many, being and non-being, reality and appearance, time and eternity, being and becoming, motion and rest. With these in play, he envisions a cosmos in which their conflicts, tensions, interactions, and deliverances dramatically unfold. Tales, stories, images, and speech of many sorts portray its epic genesis. Of particular interest to him are the ways in which these ultimate features, seemingly so remote, pertain to human affairs and implicate the soul. Many accounts, figurations, and descriptions of the soul appear in Plato's writings, but the most engaging is the philosophic soul. Socrates embodies it completely, but usually plays at being something else. Claiming to understand nothing but love and impersonating the soul of Eros, he celebrates the attractions of the many beautiful bodies so often found in his company, but without succumbing to them. Thus disguised, he goes happily about his business, seeking to transform Eros into Philos in the souls of his companions, where and when he can. He is willing to talk to everyone, and evidently does, but he likes especially to converse with young aristocrats who in their pride and strength aspire to rule, and thus, for their own good and everybody else's, would benefit most if smitten by philosophy. A story of how this might happen is told in the Symposium by Diotima, who is present in the dialogue only in Socrates' tale of her as his once upon a time instructress in the erotic arts. According to her, the correct procedure in the activities of Eros is to begin with beautiful bodies, move upward to beautiful deeds, then to beautiful acts of understanding, and finally to an understanding of the beautiful itself, where if anyone should happen to see it, pure, clear, unmixed, and not contaminated with human flesh and color and a lot of other mortal silliness, he would be able to give birth to true virtue, and by giving birth to it and nourishing it, he would become a friend of the gods, and if any human being would become immortal, he would. In the Phaedrus, there is another encounter between the erotic and the philosophic soul in the persons of Phaedrus and Socrates. In this conversation, enlivened by the question of whether, why, and when to gratify a lover, the upward thrust of Eros is also depicted and its proper bridling extolled. In the course of this exploratory inquiry, a primary feature of the soul appears. The characteristic that constitutes the essence and definition of the soul, Socrates tells Phaedrus, is that which changes itself. That is why it is immortal and why it gives life to the body when it enters it. In the Laws, which stands as Plato's last word on this subject, this formulation is echoed and its ontological significance is expanded. The definition of this thing, to which the name soul is given, the Athenian stranger says, is the motion capable of moving itself, and that self-moving soul is the same being as that which is the first generation and motion of the things that exist, that have come into being and will be, and all the opposites of these. Another account of the relationship of immortal soul to mortal body is presented in the Phaedo, where the philosophical soul gets all the attention after Socrates' young wife, accompanied by their infant son, makes a nuisance of herself by weeping and is banished from the final visitation and the claims of Eros with her. The story goes like this. The soul brings life to the body, but the soul's association with it is unwelcome. The body is an impediment. Attachment to it and its unceasing alternation of pleasure and pain is bondage. We come into our true estate only when we are free of it. The way a man can be freed from all anxiety about the state of his soul is to become deeply dissatisfied with all bodily pleasures and adornments and devote himself to the pleasures of acquiring knowledge. Then he need have no fear of death. Here it is not Eros ascending, but Philos. After the arguments for the soul's immortality have been seen through, and before the arrival of the hemlock, Socrates imagines a fabulous journey beyond the earth of experience and even beyond what he calls the true earth to a splendid place where pious souls ascend post-mortem to reside, and those who have purified themselves with philosophy dwell forever in mansions pure and fair. In this dialogue, Socrates and philosophic discourse, seen now to be essentially the same, find their fulfillment. All distractions have been distanced. Talk can actually be what it might be at its best. The pertinent question, how shall I die, is understood to mean, how ought I to live? The philosopher's preparation for death is shown to be the proper rule for living the best life. Socrates departs in joy, assured that the mode of discourse to which he has given himself will fare well without him. Neither weep nor mourn, he tells his companions, only keep talking. Thus, in a moment of enduring poignancy, are Socrates and the soul of philosophic discourse both immortalized. As I'm sure you remember, the symposium ends with most of the guests gone home, and the rest asleep except for Agathon, Aristophanes, and Socrates, who is insisting that the same man could write both comedies and tragedies. Whether or not Plato was making a case for his own potential versatility, the fact is that from first to last, his choice was comedy. The elements of tragedy might have been present in the life of Socrates, but Plato played it another way. The face of the philosophic life is a comic face, the face of Socrates. Comic, too, are the features of the Platonic cosmos. Terrible deeds may be done there, but nothing tragic can occur. The one is triumphant in Plato's cosmos as the good, a being said to be beyond being, and the father of all. There is no counter to it. There may be a lack of it, but there is no evil to oppose it. On earth, or above it, or below it, there is nothing to dread. There are no dark powers. The worst there can be is ignorance and an absence of the light. Plato's ambition, it seems clear enough, was to inspire his readers and auditors with his vision, and change their ways of being and thinking. This meant displacing the Homeric religion and contending with the tragic poets who continued to give it voice. This is why he toyed with the idea of banning them from the playtime polity we know as the Republic. It is hard for us to see, perhaps, that the tales the poets told were not merely entertaining stories. They were accounts of the gods, real beings that had been seen and spoken to, and whose intercourse with humans might have fateful consequences. They had their temples, their sacred places, where pious votaries went in awe to pray, make offerings, seek solace, and ask counsel. This sense of the divine was the manner in which reality was apprehended. It informed feeling and judgment. Its exactions and deliverances shaped conduct. Its evocations of fate and tragic dread weighed on the souls of generations and stirred consequential passions that led to bloody and destructive outcomes. As a religion, it was weakening. There were critics. There were many who neglected its observances. There were new and foreign deities. Socrates and Glaucon, we are told, went down to the Piraeus one night to see a torchlight procession in honor of one of these. But the Homeric religion had its adherents, and unless the execution of Socrates was purely political, they were powerful enough to make him pay for his evident lack of conventional piety. Socrates speaks often of honoring the gods and believes he does so, but the gods that excite his enthusiasm are not the Olympians. Here might a hecatomb be offered up in praise and thanks for Plato's imagined cosmos and the love of the good that inspired its invention and the storied hero who embodies it. So consider this done, with lauds proclaimed and genuinely meant. Add too, perhaps, a prayer of contrition for this light-fingered handling of Plato's corpus, and bind it all with a solemn oath that of such trials this shall be the last. Then to the point you know by now I have to make. In my case, Plato's consciousness-informing efforts, although clearly influential, have enjoyed less than complete success. An eternal frolic of words in some distant realm beyond imagining might be just the ticket, and the proffered glory of an endless time to talk and think is not to be despised. But I can't help wishing there might be a higher calling for philosophy than preparing us to die, even if this statement of its mission is half ironically meant. I like instead to imagine it as if it were inspired to teach the body's wayward offspring how to stop disdaining the terms of its birth, overcome its self-orphaned state, and be reconciled with its true parent. But this is just my take on it, the outcry of a body thinking through its being and eager to consider any art or craft that honestly might undo the anguished separation its own being has induced. By my reckoning, a soul that quits the body in despair of it is nothing saved. To many another, as we know, Plato's new world of words came as a revelation. Inspired by Plato's vision of the good, Aristotle imagined a pure intelligence, an unmoved mover, the highest and best of beings, and made the love of it, incorporate in all things, the final cause of motion and the ground of cosmic order. Augustine, the repentant Manichaean, took it another way, wedded the Platonic vision to Christian doctrine, and made the body more despised. As it spread afar, Plato's ongoing thought changed beliefs and lives and institutions, thus making manifest the shaping power of mythopoiesis. In this it is exemplary, but not, of course, unique. Another myth of ancient origin, awesome in its power, is even less remote from us than Plato's compositions. Before Plato lived to think about the good, Democritus taught that atoms, uncuttable particles, were the stuff of which all things are made. Lucretius, hearing this story hundreds of years later and being enchanted by it, crafted the poem that delivered it to the modern world, and the modern world to it. This myth has set more things astir than any other, graphically demonstrating its ultimacy and blowing past its name. In the awful radiance of its oxymoronic incarnation, a message flashed, seen at once by the man who oversaw its birth only a few dozen miles from here. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds, it said. More subdued, the myth of an ultimate particle enjoys another life, fulfilling and denying itself at CERN, where bits of stuff are smashed into smaller and smaller bits, leaving us to wonder whether its devotees are making or discovering what they see, whether there is truly any uncuttable thing after all, and whether the accounts of these many evanescent fragments can ever be made one. So myths are real, no doubt about it, and very much alive, even in our science-illumined age. The list of those extant is about as long as you care to make it. Gender, race, ethnicity, barbarism, nationhood, Western civilization, mind, soul, ego, id, will, idealism, materialism, determinism, serendipity, providence, fate, karma, the self-made man, the American dream, the great American novel, the invisible hand, dialectical materialism, trickle-down economics, the entrepreneurial spirit, the global economy, progress, the survival of the fittest, the Big Bang, the primal ooze, the entropic soup, the laws of nature, original sin, hell, heaven, samsara, nirvana, the end times, the perfect storm, the colonization of space. We need only keep talking for more to come. Given the world enough and time, it might be instructive to pluck a few specimens from this gaudy array and expand them for a better view. Then they might be seen to burst from such inflation, or arrange themselves in hierarchies, or drift away into vacuity, or be tethered to reality by some validating tie. The question of the moment, though, is not which of these ways of seeing or saying things might be true, half-true, or not true at all, or what counts as evidence for or against them, or how the truth claims they make might be settled. The significant fact is that we feel drawn to some of them, and repelled by some, and indifferent to others. Our many-storied lives are abuzz with multiplicity, and are further complicated by the fact that we find ourselves responsible for making our way through this welter and putting our own story into one or some or many of the possible contexts imagined or seen. Why is it? Why is it? And how is it that we choose to embody one story or another and give it life? Why and how is it that we sacrifice our bodies in defense of this account or that, or give them up to obliterate another? But now I am only pondering questions that Plato's dialogues so often dramatize, even as they show us what it is like for something to be so deeply believed it is never to be let go, and yet so lightly held that the believer never knowingly harms himself or any other in its name. If we wanted to say why and how Plato's teachings, or those found in the Vedas or anywhere else, caught on and endured, we might be able to give an account of how they passed from time to time and place to place by discovering who heard them and carried them abroad, or wrote them down and transmitted them to others. We could recount decisions made, actions taken, deeds done, institutions founded. What we cannot say is how, for their hearers and practitioners, they intimated their meaning and significance, informed consciousness, became the tissue and texture of the real, the ground of experience, a guide to conduct, a revelation of how things are and what they might become. Every attempt to explain this is another story, perhaps more eloquent and persuasive, more connected to its own parts, and broader in consequences than the last, but still another story. Story, by another name, is mythos, speech, and speech is sound, or air broken, as Chaucer termed it, air bitten and shaped by teeth and tongue, a mighty wind indeed. So I do not think it is too much to say that consciousness, informed and active, the quintessence of things it might almost be called, is a natural force. David Chalmers, after thinking much about the problem of consciousness, as it has come to be known in philosophical circles, has suggested that we ought to treat conscious experience as a fundamental fact we cannot explain. To this I say, hear, hear, let's give that story a chance. But no, this is a thought from which thought itself recoils. Too defeatist. Everything can and must be explained, cries the commanding myth of the modern age. There's another way to deal with the problem of consciousness, and that is to treat it as a kind of irrelevant idling that has no power at all. George Santayana, the Harvard philosopher and younger colleague of William James, denied its efficacy and dismissed it as a lyric cry in the midst of business. Thomas Henry Huxley, known as Darwin's bulldog, for his fierce defense of the theory of evolution, likened it to the whistle of a steam engine. Could consciousness be reduced completely to the perfect detachment of the unseen seer, this might seem plausible, but such a reduction is probably not why its efficacy is denied. A thoroughgoing determinist such as Huxley cannot allow an act of consciousness to change things, since it cannot be shown to be a link in a chain of physical causes. To allow for the possibility of a spontaneous thought, or to suppose that an activity of consciousness might be an originating event, not entirely derivable from its antecedents, amounts on Huxley's view to nothing but nonsense. About to be awakened here, should it be allowed to arise, is a mythical encounter between a purported creation ex nihilo by the power of thought itself and the contrary conviction that out of nothing, nothing comes, and thinking is purely incidental to everything that is. The trick is not to be disturbed by the contention between two accounts, each of which claims to be all-encompassing, and neither of which can be true. The trick is to salute in passing the fact of self-initiated activity, which we could do or not, and let all sleeping theories lie. As evidence for the conviction that thinking matters and gets things done, I intend to point to things easily stumbled upon, knowing that to sophisticated reasoners this may seem as fatuous as Dr. Johnson's famous attempt in something of a contrary case to refute the doctrines of Bishop Berkeley by kicking a stone. Nevertheless, I mean to keep on talking about some of the things we know thinking can do without being able to say how it actually does them. An array of its workings can be seen immediately to support our shared cogitations. Even if it is not in all senses fundamental, you are sitting on one of them now, and we are surrounded by others. Chairs, walls, and window glass are thoughts made into things. If we want to learn how this is accomplished, we must ask the craftsman and study the craft, and perhaps take it up ourselves. This will let us see, as clearly as we ever can, how thinking does this sort of stuff. We might summarize the coming into being of a chair by saying that the desire to rest comfortably engendered it, the labor of limbs and hands produced it, and thinking was alive in the effort from the beginning and shaped it all the way. Making things is as much the business of consciousness as telling stories. Its artifacts are durable, and in some cases unendurable, goods. Once they are around and about and available for interaction, the things our consciousness makes can change not only our practices, but our thinking too. When a new thing enters the story changes, and the changing story brings about thoughts and things not previously known or done or seen. Coins, buttons, telephones, automobiles, light bulbs, the telephone, the pill, naming them might go on forever. But the artifactual transmission of speech, the book, in its many forms and formats, past, present, and to come, is the one still unequaled in its world-bearing work of storing thoughts and depicting things so that those able to read it can employ, extend, alter, undo, reshape, or renew the very terms of consciousness itself. However, instead of continuing to talk about thought as it inhabits things, I want to take a detour and speak less concretely by considering some of its thinking's doings when its primary business remains with itself. One thing it can do is fix its terms to make them unequivocal and limit its ways of regarding them and manipulating them by applying rules that are precisely fixed. Then their relations, if seen or employed in one way, cannot be seen or employed in a contradictory manner. A or not A, we are always free to say, with no fear of mishap, but never both A and not A, or the act of thought is wrecked. Thinking can also allow itself more amplitude and let one thing lead to another less rigorously, and it can loosen its character farther still in daydreams and free association. It can open itself to alternative perspectives and considerations, narrow its purview due to need or interest, or bind itself with a creed. All the variations between the most and the least limited of these practices are also available to it. Mathematics and formal logic are its most straitened and constrained activities, while daydreaming and the play of fancy leave themselves open to whatever may occur. In between are techniques of many sorts, where a rule of thumb, as in planting potatoes by the phases of the moon, a set of procedures for gathering evidence and drawing conclusions, as in a science, an arbitrary imposition, as in a sonnet or a symphony, or a principle of efficiency, as in the manufacture of pins, limits the possibilities and governs the activity. This reaches its limit in the formulation called the universal machine or Turing machine, now regarded as the theoretical basis of the electronic computer, where information is reduced to its simplest terms, yes, no, on, off, 1 or 0, and a rule is prescribed to determine their successive alternations. The actual machines built to carry out this abstract program are among the many artifacts of thinking. They have come to such prominence that they seem to offer the promise or threat of a new incorporation of thinking itself. Whether these machines can think has been a topic of debate ever since they were first imagined, a question that fascinated Turing himself. My opinion, as you might suspect, is that they can't, and for much the same reason that I do not believe clocks can tell time, or books, although made up of thoughts, can think. I believe computers are so good at what they do because they are unable to stop and think, and having no cares, they never need to. Whether we want to call them thinking machines or not has much to do with whether thinking is regarded as inherently, essentially, basically, really, use any term you want, what it is in its simplest, most determined, and most invariant form, 1 or 0, then the one again, or the other, without inherent meaning or signification. That it can be reduced to this and implemented by a machine quicker than blazes is evident, but to hold that this sort of operation is the basis of all thinking and the paradigmatic form of intelligence is something else again. And the something else is what we've been talking about a good deal already. It is myth. That doesn't mean it can't be true. It only indicates its actual standing in our thinking life. Perhaps consciousness is a machine all the way down, as a prominent explainer of it has said, and all we are really doing is externalizing our mechanical endowment as an information processing device and making it faster and more durable before completing the program and turning everything over to it. This vision is so well funded and so many hearts are in it that it begins to feel like fate, a consequence of human doings no human can undo. Perhaps other living things will fare better when all of Earth's creatures are given over to the keeping of machines, since they have neither appetites nor ambitions nor ends of their own. Sometimes I can't help wondering, though, what there will be for us to do when machines do everything for us, including all our thinking. One answer is already unfolding. They will teach us how to play with them. But I digress, perhaps obsessively. My primary interest here, to return to it, is the computer as a particular artifact of thinking, and only one among a host of other things. The embodiments of thinking are all around us, as I noted a moment ago, and we live amidst things that only exist because thinking has produced them. Yet it never happens quite as easily as it did for the great self of the Upanishads. Things don't pop up just because a powerful thinker looks around and calls them into being. The thing made is more than any wish for it and every account of it. No thought becomes a thing unless somebody works or is worked upon, puts it into play, or is put in play by it. Without a body of some sort, either living or artifactual, thinking is not to be found. The being of thinking is in its expression, and its expression wants a body. Insubstantial as it is, it must, if it is to persist, inform or shape another body, whether physical or figurative, air, paper or stone, a house, a windmill or a temple, a legislature, an organization, a corporation. Even to be present to the thinker, it requires some embodiment in images, words, sounds, some formulation to fix it for inspection and endorsement or dismissal. Thinking goes into all sorts of things, but especially into words, so much so that thoughts and words seem almost to be the same, and thinking might be only a silent dialogue with ourselves, as a stranger in the sophist says. But it is their deliverance that matters, and this is what I want to turn to now, taking this instance as my momentary theme, and putting the substance of my case before you as overtly as I can. The day after we decided to spend the month of July in Santa Fe, I was delving around in a bunch of stuff I had written, checking to see if there was anything worth salvaging, when I chanced upon some notes I had made at one time or another regarding Plato's use of imitation. Wading through them, a notion of something else I might want to say sprang up. This led to something else, then something else again, and on it went. Before my enchantment ended, I had written David Carl an email to ask if there might be a lecture date still open in July. He said there was. A date and a deadline might have stoppered my enthusiasm, as I have known it to do so often in the past, but this is not what happened. I found that I had set before myself an epic feast of words, and on, course after course, it came. Or to put it better, by switching metaphors in mid-repast to the one that is most apt. A stream of honeyed words poured themselves into my consciousness, making me their thrall. You may suppose I exaggerate and poeticize. You have my word that I do not. This is just how it went. Sentence after sentence, with no constructive effort on my part, the talk I hoped to bring here delivered itself to me. I had only to attend, try to keep up with it on the fly, and trust my feverish scribbling and faltering memory to prevent all of it from vanishing, like the smoke of a spent fire, into oblivion. The voice that spoke was wonderfully perverse. Sit myself down in front of my computer ready to transcribe it, and it would die away. Attempt to edit or rearrange it as it came, and it would fall into resentful muttering. Try to stop it when it wasn't ready to quit, and its powers of spontaneous self-generation easily proved themselves too much. Still, it was a gift. I was sure of that. The answer to a would-be writer's prayer. A voice that played itself effortlessly without, it seemed, so much as a whisper of work. It was nothing if not a reward for a lifetime's devotion to words, more fulsome than ever I dared hope, more compelling than I could have dreamed. Never was the burden of my existence, putting myself into words, so lightly borne. A muse, my own Calliope, alive in my ear at last. Had this come in another place and time, I might have believed myself chosen by a higher power to appear before you at this fated hour and haul down truth from the clouds. But I knew it for what it was, my body trained and tuned to speak, responding freely to its self-engendered circumstance, and articulating itself for its own entertainment and appraisal and embrace. Never was a voice more enamored of itself. As far as I was concerned, it might have kept speaking forever, if only to its enraptured audience of one. How I wish you could have been there. How I wish I could have just blown in here and opened up and let her rip. But no, I couldn't do that. For one thing, an hour would not have put a patch on it, or a day either, and I doubt a week would have been enough. No, I had somehow to bottle it, or pickle it, and put it up in paragraphs. That, first the muse, and then the furies, that is where the trouble came. I speak as someone who would rather dig a ditch or build a barn than fill a page with words, as I once spent some of the best years of my life proving. But having made this date with destiny while it still wore the guise of glory, I knew I had to feed what I could into my word processing machine and show up with what I could capture of my almighty musings, printed and in hand. So sparing you an account of the months of splendid misery this entailed and the awful sacrifice of so many of my darlings it required, here I am, as I think I've already shown and said, and here we are, and we are almost done. I have put my fable to such music as I can, and I must make an end. There is only one more thing I came to say. You may have guessed already what it is. Something more essential to thinking, I believe, than Descartes' vacuous, I think. Something of which thinking was never the cause, yet is the truest analogue of its arising. My last word on the matter of consciousness, for I too have my intuitions and must be true to them, my last word can only be this: breath, breath, flowing inward and outward between the glottis and the nostrils, breath, now and again, though not forever, breath.